Good afternoon. Hello, team. Nice to see you all. Welcome to Narrative Podcasts. I'm really glad to see you guys took time out for the incredibly sunny Saturday to come and sit in the fresh, cool air with us. I'm Laura Sheeter. I'm the co-founder and creative director of Chalk and Blade, a podcast specialist production company. It's been going for more than 6 years now. I'm moderating today's panel, and the guests I have here, all people who have produced and or hosted and presented incredible narrative shows, which I hope you'll get to hear a lot about today. I'll work from the other side of the room this way. First is Moya Lothian-McLean. She is a journalist and editor who explores politics and digital culture and history, and she's also the writer and host of Human Resources, which is a podcast made with broccoli content, and it's on its third season. I think you said you're about to start the third season?
Just started writing the script for season 3 yesterday. So.
And that series uncovers how Britain's slaving past really shapes our present day, and it takes you, everywhere. So I'll get Moya to tell you a bit more about it shortly. Next to her on the far sofa, Anishka Sharma is a senior editor and executive producer at Whistledown Productions. She works on factual audio of all kinds, so radio as well as podcasting, the poor relation, and for networks including the BBC, Audible and Spotify. And most recently, Anishka worked on a podcast made for Audible called The Bias Diagnosis, which is a 5-part series investigating racial bias in medicine. And the show won Best Radio and Podcast category at the Amnesty International Media Awards this year. Next to me is Cara McGoogan. She's the Telegraph's first narrative audio journalist. She's the writer and host of their strand Bed of Lies, which I imagine quite a few of you have heard. The first season told the stories of women caught up in one of Britain's biggest state secrets who were tricked into relationships with undercover police officers. The second season covers a very different scandal. It followed the infected blood inquiry into how people came to be treated with infected blood products and told the stories of those affected. I don't even know how many awards you've won. Every time I look at your Twitter feed, you seem to be holding a new trophy, so multi-award winning. And in fact, I think you're working on a show that you're not hosting that's launching tomorrow?
Yes, called Bethel. The trailer will be out tomorrow.
Excellent. Well, we can plug that again later.
Thanks.
The idea of today is that we'll share insights and experiences having made narratives and talk about some of the issues we've experienced or seen in the industry in narrative podcasting, some of the challenges and hopes for the format. And there'll be about 15 minutes at the end for questions. So any of you got any burning questions, please note them down and save them for the last 15 minutes. I think I'll start in reverse order now. If each of you could tell me a little bit about your narrative series and how it came about.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction, Laura. I'm Cara, and I've been at the Telegraph for about approaching 7 years now. And I was a feature writer a couple of years ago, and I really wanted to tell a story in more depth, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts over the years, quite obsessively. And we had a new head of audio, and I approached her and was like, I want to make a podcast series. And amazingly, she just said, okay, let's do it, with kind of no background in audio at all. So I took a few ideas to her, one of which was the Spy Cop scandal. I had written a feature for the Telegraph on it and just felt I haven't even scratched the surface here. There are so many untold stories, and there's been nothing that kind of tells this scandal in full from the women's perspective. And so I kind of spoke to the women about whether they might be up for it, and spoke to the podcast editor, and then she commissioned it a month before the pandemic.
Nice, always good timing.
Yeah.
Anishka, we'll come back to it. Cliffhanger note. Anishka, tell us a bit about the bias diagnosis.
Yes, so this is a 5-part series for Audible, and essentially we were investigating how racial bias affects the practice of medicine, and also if it affects the treatment of healthcare, because I think we do often see articles suggesting there are statistics around how people of colour have worse health outcomes, and we wanted to say, where did this come from? How is this something that seems to go under the radar? What could be done to change things and improve things for people of colour when they're going through a healthcare service? We had 5 episodes, which the first one started with the foundation of knowledge. So what knowledge do they use to practice medicine, and where can bias maybe infiltrate that? We looked at prejudice around pain and how pain can be a subjective thing when you're treating it, and that racial bias could come into play there. We looked at mental health, childbirth, and also, similar to Cara, we made this just before the pandemic, and so we really felt that COVID needed to be investigated because, unfortunately, again, people of colour had worse health outcomes in COVID. And our presenter was a brilliant, now qualified doctor, Dr. Ivan Beckley, but when we approached him, he was just about to qualify, and he was just about to come into this industry, and so it was his journey of so he is also a person of colour, and asking how does he feel about the knowledge and the tools that he's been given to treat people. Does he feel equipped to diagnose things when actually they're not always in the textbooks and there aren't always images of people of colour? Things tend to be, there's more in circulation around certain types of bodies. So it was his it was amazing that he worked with us in his final year when he was very busy with exams, and him talking to lots of other junior doctors and experts in the field to kind of decide whether this is the path for him, essentially.
Great. Moya, tell us about how human resources came about.
Yeah, of course. So the idea is actually Renee Richardson's, who is the CEO of Broccoli, who is an amazing producer, editor, everything under the sun. And she came to me, and we'd met previously because I'd been involved in a program called Spotify Sound Up, which tried to get women of colour into podcasting, and Renee had been one of the mentors. And I met her through that program, and several months down the line, she rang me up and said, look, are you interested in history? And I said, funny you say that, my degree was in history. And she said, well, I've got this idea for this podcast, it's about Britain and slavery. And instantly, I was so fascinated because I'm half Jamaican, and if you've seen me talk about this podcast before, you probably heard me say this, but I didn't know my father growing up at all. And this felt very connected to that history. And I was like, okay, well, there's a personal story there, and then there's the wider story about, being white British, black Jamaican. This is clearly so involved with the history of slavery. Yeah, I do want to do this podcast. And so from there, we started thinking about it initially as based in places. So it was going to be a sort of history of British slavery told through places. And we'll probably go into this later, as we kept exploring the topic, we were like, we need to open up even more than that. And we discovered so many things instantly. It was right there. It was just staring us in the face about how much slavery shaped Britain's present, and the way and the contrast with how it's thought of. So slavery is often thought of as like this very distinct, constrained period in time. It was an industry that happened and then it stopped and then that was it. And we still have anti-black racism particularly, but that's all we think about in terms of slavery, and it's like, that's it. Well, no, slavery is important in shaping Britain as the Industrial Revolution, which everyone still talks about constantly. So the subject was so rich, and there were so many people out there who'd done this research, and just for some reason, well, we know the reason, they weren't being heard on a platform, and that's how human resources came about.
So, all three of you covering huge, massive topics in your shows, and they could be the subject of, and have been the subject of, lots of very sort of straight up documentaries, feature writing, especially when you had a background that wasn't maybe in audio. But narrative treatment is something different. The three narratives that I've made through Chalk and Blade most recently, one was called The Messenger. It was the story of a British journalist who'd been reporting on young British jihadis and had been working with one guy who said he'd left the network and wanted to write an autobiography to encourage other people to leave the network. And this journalist got then arrested by counter-terrorism police who wanted his sources, and went all the way to the High Court to protect his sources, and was then betrayed by his source. And we had a whole load of dream tape of that one, but that was a very personal story that resonated with much bigger issues. The other two that I've made with John Sweeney, one is Hunting Ghislaine, which we made for Global about Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, but that was very much through the lens of Ghislaine Maxwell's life. And the one that we're making at the moment, that we're just on the last 2 episodes of, is about Vladimir Putin. We started it a year before the war, not thinking it was going to be very newsy, just because I'm a bit geeky about Russia. And then John went to Kiev just before the war broke out, and so it's been very much kind of recasting that around a much bigger story. How did you, each of you, conceive of your shows to find those personal stories? Because in some cases, that personal story is you. Like Moya, for you, it starts with you.
Oh, we're starting with me, literally. Yeah, I mean, as I said in sort of the last answer I gave to the question, then because I had this personal history, it was so obvious to begin there to bring people into the story with me. So the very first episode of Human Resources starts with me in my home county of Herefordshire, and we're looking at the links between, and it felt so serendipitous, which is so strange. Like, we're looking at the links between a school in my home county and England's very first official slave trader. And you couldn't get a more sort of like chronological beginning, but it wasn't always going to be like that. You can't just go in chronology with this podcast because it's very like fluid. The history of slavery, because it interweaves with everything, we go back and forth in time. So yeah, it was a lot of times when you're making things like narrative podcasts, people talk about going on a journey, and I think it just fell into I was the one going to be on that journey. And so what's interesting about the way you then craft the narrative is often when the way we record, I have to both have done all the interviews and we have the knowledge of what's coming up in this season and the sort of themes that we want to explore, but then I have to take myself back to being an audience member who doesn't maybe know this stuff yet and is still working it out throughout the course of the episode. So scripting, you have to put yourself back in that mindset of what was I like going into this interview or before I read this book, and what was I thinking, and how do I convey that and become like this avatar for the audience. But that's almost quite a very traditional way of doing narrative podcasts. So I'm interested to see what the others say.
Yeah. I mean, Anishka, you, like with the bias diagnosis, you have to find your host, your character who was more than just, was kind of more than normally invested, I would say, more than a normal journalist was invested. What made you decide to do it that way? And how hard was it to find him?
Yeah, it's interesting because we were really clear that we didn't want someone who was high up in the medical field and therefore knew a lot of, or had encountered a lot of where bias had come into play, because I think they'd just be coming at it from a very different angle, whereas with Ivan, his evidence of it thus far, unfortunately, had been anecdotal, so family, friends, and also his own kind of journey through the healthcare service. And I think, therefore, he was almost with the listener on an equal level of going through this and learning it with them, which I think is, and also, I don't know if all of us kind of adopted that idea of whenever Ivan shared his thoughts in the episode, it really felt like he was talking just to one listener, because it was it's a big decision for his career of what he wants to do. So finding him was, it really all fell into place, I think, when we found him and found someone who wanted to ask these questions, because you're asking a lot for someone who is going to go and talk to people that they may end up working with. And I think the same thing for our contributors, just having so much gratitude and value for the fact that they shared their stories with us and what that allowed us to then investigate. So I think the people who kindly offer their stories, and particularly the way Ivan offered his personal journey, was just hugely valuable.
That's great. Cara, for you, I feel like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like it was slightly different because you are the host and you draw people along, and there are some incredible moments of journalistic breakthrough where you're kind of sat there going, are they going to get this person to talk or not? But actually, somehow for me, it's the narrative of the sort of group of people that you found who are victims of, in both cases, really horrendous injustice, and weaving those stories together. How did you come to decide to do it that way rather than a kind of more traditional feature style?
Well, I didn't go into either series with a sort of prescriptive way that I was going to tell these stories. But what I did know, I'd written features about both stories before, and I'd met some key campaigners and told a couple of people's stories in print. And so I had their trust and I had sort of initial access to them. But what was clear for me in both these scandals, undercover policing scandal, where I think there's somewhere around 50 women have found out that they had relationships with an undercover cop. Maybe like 30 who are sort of semi-active campaigners. And the infected blood scandal, there's some 1,200 people who contracted HIV and approaching 5,000 who were given hepatitis C. So those numbers are huge. And I think what other stories on these subjects had done was failed to convey the scale. And so what I really want to do is convey the scale of those scandals. But I didn't know kind of who my main characters would be going in, and I just spent months meeting people, hearing their stories, learning the things that had happened to them, how they were similar, how they were different. And so for series 1, the undercover policing scandal, I found the best way to tell the story because there were so many overlaps. You know, there's things like these men always arrived in the women's lives with a van and keen to, you know, enter the activism scene. And you hear this over and over again. Oh yeah, he had a van, so he'd drive us to protests. And you're like, well, we need to show that this is like a police tactic, that they were providing these men with a van so that they would be at the heart of the action. And so when you sort of have multiple women telling you that through their own lens, and then you can sort of make a montage of that, you start to see the sort of scale of what happened rather than the sort of one person's story, which I think traditional print had done. And for the blood scandal, it was slightly different, but you know, I wanted to kind of give people a chance to share their stories because they have just been completely ignored for the last 40 years. And so I got so many emotional responses after the podcast came out, just thanking me for having listened to them and for telling their stories. And I think it's probably the first time that the general public have spent hours engaging with that scandal and what happened to the people.
Yeah, I have to admit, I bawled my eyes out listening to that one.
Yeah, sorry.
No, don't. It's fine. I would say that the thing that really strikes me with a lot of what we're talking about is bringing enormous stories down to the personal. And that's great, and it's got impact, and you have people who, you know, sometimes grateful to be heard, but also means there's an awful lot of responsibility around that and the ethics of using a very personal story, both to expose that personal story and that person's, you know, what's happened to them, and also to illustrate a wider point, to make them, you know, you're not obviously unthinkingly making them example. But I was kind of interested, especially Anishka, you've got some sort of patients or family members of people who really suffered, and one of whom I remember particularly in the first episode who was bereaved, his wife had died. How did you kind of work with that? Because, I mean, when you're using them to sustain a narrative, it's slightly different from using them for sort of an illustrative clip. You've also got it sounds a bit tasteless, but there's also that sense that you need their dramatic story to sustain that, you know, in the listener's interest.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought this up because for me, duty of care is just paramount, and actually I prefer to say that the people are more important than the podcast and they're more important than the story, and I would always rather their well-being actually takes precedent over the success of us telling a story. So it was unfortunate that we started just before the pandemic because I do think a lot of duty of care comes from being in person and comes from that is quite an important way that you build up trust. So I think in exchange for that, we used time. So we really were careful to not let anyone feel at all rushed, that they need to have no sense of like us and the structure of what we're making. We just want to check if they want to share their story and if that's something that would be meaningful for them, because sometimes, not always, sometimes people, when they share their story for podcasts, it is helpful in their own journey just in life of how they view it, because it allows them a moment of reflection or it allows them a moment of catharsis and sometimes closure. I don't want to claim that that always happens, but sometimes it can, and I think that is also part of your duty of care, figuring out what is the takeaway that this experience can give for them, not just what can it do for the podcast. So we spent a lot of time on the phone, you know, you do, and it sounds like, Cara, really similar to you, and I'm sure on your podcast as well, that we spend time with, they're called pre-interviews, a lot of time just talking to people, letting them feel comfortable with the kind of questions you're asking, and then the aftercare is, I think, really, really important. So checking what they might feel comfortable, knowing how you've used the material and what way they might want to be kept informed, and particularly when your podcast is released, that you continue that duty of care, you continue the aftercare, making sure that they know how it's going out into the world, what kind of marketing there is around it. Yeah, because they're offering you so much that this feels like the right thing to do in exchange.
What about you, Cara? Were there any people that you felt like you needed to leave out, or people who you've been surprised or willing to be part of?
Yeah, I guess for the second series, I guess there's kind of some overlaps because you're talking about people's health experiences as well for that, and often quite traumatic health experiences. I spent a lot of time at the infected blood inquiry, just sort of being there, and you find a lot of people are kind of curious about you and they want to know what you're doing. They're kind of interested in what the project might be and what you could bring to it. And so kind of just being there to have those conversations and then scoping out who might be interested, who feels like their side of the story hasn't really had much airtime before. We have one interview with a woman called Frankie, that's a pseudonym, and she has a really horrific story. Her husband was infected, had haemophilia, he was infected with HIV, which she later contracted off him. But they fell pregnant while kind of right in the early days of the AIDS crisis. Her husband was just discovering he had HIV. They didn't realise she was pregnant until late in the process, and doctors sort of forced her to have a termination at 7 months, which to this day is so heartbreaking to hear her talking about it. She is completely scarred by it still. She never had a chance to have children after that. And so she, there was a real sense that she did not have to share this story if she did not want to. I didn't want to make her share it. I was like, this is horrendous, and I think people will be shocked to know that happened. But you have to kind of decide that you want to do it. And we had quite a lot of conversation about, she actually felt that she wanted to sit down and do this. She wanted to do it in a neutral space at the inquiry, not at her home. So we made those allowances. We kind of kept it brief. And, she did. I made sure in the podcast to include all the parts where she says, I want to tell you this because I want to kind of almost unburden myself and for people to know. And then I'm going to kind of shut the door and I'm going to move on. And so it was nice to feel like we could sort of be a part of that for her. But yeah, it was difficult because it's not something she hadn't even told her family until like 2 years ago. So it really had to be her decision.
Yeah, that's incredible. Talking about, you mentioned it, Moya, earlier, the idea that when you come to script and you have to sort of take yourself back to the beginning of the process, I want to talk a little bit about story arc and structure, because actually it's a whole separate, in the States, it's a whole separate job title. It's like story editor, and there are people who do that day in, day out. Lucky them for their, for other people's work that they pull together and come in and go, no, you don't need any of that. Why did you bother? Most of the time. But I was really interested to know if you've got any particular, especially sort of practical tips or particular challenges around it, because, running a story over 5, 6, 7, 8, 12 episodes and keeping that thread going is a very particular kind of challenge. Half an hour is quite hard enough to do that, but then several of those and running a theme over that period is, I think, a skill that really you have to learn by doing sometimes. So I was wondering if you had any particular, or just talk us through your process.
Sure. I mean, mine's probably a bit unorthodox because I came to narrative podcasts and podcast scripting having never done it before, and Renee is one of those people where she picks up people she thinks has talent from other industries and is like, just go and do it. So she doesn't give you any sort of prescriptive, this is the way the script should be formatted. She's like, have a go, and then she'll go over and edit anything. So the way I do it is literally just open up a Google Doc and put my name and then say what I'm going to say. But the things that I use when I'm starting a human resources script is, first of all, I think of so first of all, we do a structure for the season, and I look at all the themes we're going to cover this season, and I say, okay, what's the overarching thread between them, for example? With season 2, it was very much going deeper into these stories and looking at things in the abstract rather than just specific places and people. It was saying, like, how can we make people listen to this and come away with their horizons about how things connect, having been expanded, and make people listen to this and almost thinking, I would say, history is at its best when you're telling it in a poetic way, and you're making people think outside of sort of like linear chronology and dates, and you're making them understand that things weave together and intersect and they flow, and that's what connects us, and it's all about the human connectivity at the center. Very Cloud Atlas, if anyone's read that. But yeah, so when I start scripting, I always go in thinking, how can I pull out whatever the theme of this episode is and relate it to something that may seem completely unrelated at the beginning. So, for example, one thing that I always mention is at the start of episode 2 of season 1, I open by talking about the Tree of Life, which is obviously the mythological sort of fixture in so many stories around the world in different cultures. You always have this Tree of Life appearing as a motif. And I link that to the tree that Isaac Newton was sitting under when the apple fell and he thought about the theory of gravity, and then that links to how Isaac Newton then proved the theory of gravity using lots of different measurements, some of which were taken from slave colonies. And it's building those sort of links in people's minds where they start thinking in that really poetic way and understanding how these things interact, and then they can understand how these systems are so much bigger than simply being, say, a banking system or a way of transporting enslaved people, and they see the human sort of stories at the center. So, and it's also a way of going, if you're thinking of like your audience, I also imagine who would be the least interested in this subject, who doesn't want to listen to this podcast and they're sitting in the car and it's on. How can I make them keep listening past the first 5 minutes? So that's how I open. And then when I'm scripting, it's a case of making sure that text is sort of like broken up every now and then. If you've got someone speaking for a long period, like I am now, you need to break it up. You need to break it up with sort of someone else's narration. And we have sound designers as well, fantastic sound designers who come in and do bits of that. But it's, you know, if I've got an academic that I've interviewed and they've talked for 5 minutes and it's really interesting, still in the middle of that, I need to break up that text and ask a question and put something else in, which because we record my narration after we've done the initial interviews. So the way I think of a script is texture. How can you add texture? Because that's what's going to keep people, and you have those little mini hooks that keep people listening throughout the episode. But I'm sure you guys have different ways of approaching it. Yeah.
I think, I mean, interestingly, I think weirdly, with some of the shows we've done, where it's one person, one character, often chronological, can seem like the simplest way of doing it. But like you say, even within that, you end up with these moments where you want to pick an image to start with. I did a series 3 years ago now with Bonnie Greer called In Search of Black History. It covered some of the similar areas that you did. And we went to the, this seems, I mean, pre-COVID, it's like luxurious. We went to the Natural History Museum and went behind the scenes and met this incredible woman. And just as a sort of off-the-cuff remark, when she was talking about something else entirely, she said, did you know that the British Museum is obviously having a lot of conversations about where its stuff came from, and everyone else is, but a lot of our botanical and geological samples came as ballast in slave ships. Yeah. And then we were like, okay, that's where I want to start. This is the image that leaps out at me, and then we'll go back and talk about everything else. But even, you know, so even setting things in a chronological, wider theme, so that people know they're starting with the Stone Age and coming up to the 20th century, you can pick those moments to just stop people in their tracks, you know, the moments that make you stop. I really liked in the bias diagnosis your imaginary waiting room, Anishka. How did that come about? Or why don't you tell people about it first, because obviously...
Yeah, no, so we wanted to create a safe space for the contributors to share their stories, and also the fact that we had contributors from many different parts of the world, so it wasn't just UK focused. So we created a doctor's waiting room, which was this fictional space, but we created it to be as real as possible in the episodes. And we start each episode in this waiting room, and the person gets called over the tannoy and they go to a specific doctor's room, and that's where they kind of tell their story a little bit how you would go to a doctor and just tell them your symptoms or something. And because I think with narrative podcasts, one of the things to think about is how you end the episode and how you throw forward, and therefore how you keep listeners involved and wanting to hear the next one. And we didn't really want to do dramatic cliffhangers and things like that. So we had a passing on of the baton. So when one person had told their story in episode 1 and they left the doctor and went back to the waiting room, they would pass the next person who would be the main protagonist in episode 2 and sort of passing on the baton. And then you'd hear a little snippet of their story and just get to know them a little bit. And then hopefully that would make you want to click on to episode 2.
And then Cara, with yours, I kind of feel like my mind is slightly boggled. I'm imagining you had an enormous spreadsheet because you not only had lots of people's personal stories with different overlapping or wildly different chronologies, you also had the ongoing public inquiries, which were working, in the real time at the present time. How did you work to weave them together? Do you have a giant spreadsheet, or have you kept it all in your head?
No, I'm not that organised. I do not have. I know that some people do sort of map stories in spreadsheets. I'm not one of them. I think structure is kind of the key thing here, and once you crack your structure, everything else will hopefully kind of move its way around it. But also, that said, it needs to be a living thing. It is just kind of constantly shifting. So I guess with series 1, I feel like the structure sort of presented itself to me quite clearly. We decided to follow the women from kind of their journey of discovering who their partners were. And so you kind of start with the relationships, the men coming into their lives, and then, because the relationships were happening at different times, so we have a woman who met her partner in the 90s, and then we have one who met hers in kind of the mid-noughties. But we tell their stories concurrently. The dates are sort of not so important. It's more about kind of the process of, the arc of those relationships. And so that kind of helped move us through the series in the first one, and kind of about bringing all your material over. Episode 1 is going to kind of cover the meeting, kind of getting together, their activism, the vans, and then at the end, something's not quite right. And then about kind of seeing, okay, who tells this bit best? We'll use them, and then how can we link from something they've said to something this next person says? And so then it becomes a sort of like patchwork. But the second series was a lot harder, the structure, because you have all of the personal stories and wanting to tell them. But what we also have is trying to kind of figure out who the wrong parties are in the infected blood scandal, who's sort of to blame. And what you have is you're circling the same period of time over and over again, so 1983 to 1985, these sort of crucial years. And what I had a sort of eureka moment almost. It'd been the end of a week. I'd gone through all of my transcriptions over the last couple of weeks, been thinking and thinking, how was this going to work? And then I suddenly sort of thought, bingo, right on the sort of Friday afternoon.
That's a bit
yeah, no, I don't know quite how I managed it. And it was concurrently, two ideas were to follow the journey of the blood from the arm of the patient who'd been infected back to the source, which was from prisons and nightclubs and sort of homeless areas in America right at the height of the AIDS epidemic. And on that journey you go from episode 1 is the sort of patients, episode 2 is the doctors who administered the treatment, episode 3 the British politicians who allowed it to be imported into the UK, and then 4 and 5 the pharma companies who made it. And so you sort of follow the journey of the blood backwards, but at the same time getting kind of closer and closer to the people that are culpable, most culpable. And so because you are going over the same years, but then what's quite nice is have echoes of the case studies, the human stories, as you go back. So we find out in episode 4 or 5, spoiler, that at some point in 1983, one pharma company knew that like 100% of their products were infected with HIV. And when you get that revelation from a lawyer who discovered this, and then you hear echoes of the case studies, one of whom sadly died of his illnesses, and it's like we got married in that month. So you can sort of, horrible. But structure, you said story editing in America. I have actually been doing that job for this podcast that we have coming up next week. And it has been a challenge to kind of, how do you make a structure work for someone else's story, and what needs to move around? And it's been a real learning curve, but it's good to then know that how much you've learned from making your own series.
Definitely. It's also different when you don't collect your own material, isn't it?
I just want to add on this structure and the practical side of this. One of the things is that you do your interviews beforehand. So you have the transcripts, so then you can actually structure it that way. And also, if you have a recurring structure within a narrative podcast, loosely try and stick to it. So every you can obviously change and be flexible, but if you've got listeners who are coming back week after week, it's best not to completely blow up your structure every single week, because it confuses them. They're here for a reason, and then it's more powerful if you do one week completely deviate from that structure and have a special episode. It makes that hit even harder. So there's just two practical things I wanted to mention.
Actually, that's exactly what I was going to ask.
Oh, no.
Okay. I was also going to say, at what point, so obviously you'd collected most of your material and then you looked in detail at how to structure it. Did you have a rough, and this, I was going to ask all of you this, did you have a rough idea of how you wanted to tell it before you went out and did the interviews? Or did you wait to see what you'd turned up? I might ask Anishka first. I'd let you sit quietly for a bit.
We did have a proposal that was, because I imagine that's what all of us go through, that you have a proposal that in order to get the commission. But we were then just completely led by the audio, and we really didn't sit down and look at the structure until we had all the audio. Because one of the things I was going to mention is it sounds like a lot of us have worked on these kind of podcasts where you need to, basically I felt like we were sort of challenged with proving racism, and the fact that a lot of what people were sharing with us, some people would dismiss as, because racism can be subtle, which is it's hard to kind of explain exactly what I mean. But basically, we felt we had to be really careful to how we share these people's stories, because it was so clear that it was racism, but there were many listeners who will disagree. And how do we build up that? And that was what was just so intrinsic to the structure of it. How do we not come out in the very first episode kind of guns blazing about it, and instead, I think one of the people that wrote up about the podcast said that it felt like we built up a narrative like a lawyer does for a case. And I think that's similar to a lot of the podcasts that all of you have made, that you want to keep listeners with you and feeling that by the end of the series, they really understand how it has been proved, the thing that you're trying to get across. So yeah, for us, I don't think that always happens, and it'd be really interesting to know what everyone else does, that you're not always led by the audio. Sometimes there's a format that you've sold, and then you have to stick to that format. But for us, it really was who would be happy to share their story first, and then how do we structure that?
Moya, what do you think?
Yeah, sure. I think it also depends if you're self-producing, because you might not do a proposal in the commission, which case it's good to collect all that audio and structure afterwards, because you may not have the extra guiding hands or whatever if you're working alone or with just a very small team. So with us in the structure, I think you're right, it was building a case, but what we discovered is the more you know where to look. So the first season, you're sort of doing the more obvious spaces, the more obvious British institutions, and being how's the Bank of England linked to slavery, building those connections. And then what you're doing is peeling back like an onion, and you're going deeper and deeper, and looking at the ways Britain was also connected to the rest of the world, and how this was the global system, and going into things like, I don't know, we have an episode on the Middle Passage, and we look at the role of the sea and the concept of this really liminal space, and we're getting really, as I said, poetic at that point. And there's this phrase called the Kalunga Line, which emerged in Gold Coast, people who lived on the Gold Coast, in black Africans who became enslaved. And it didn't originally mean the line that goes across the Atlantic. It means the line that separates sort of life and death. but it came to symbolise this concept of going across the Atlantic, because for people who lived on the Gold Coast, then going across the Atlantic on these slave ships, it was a death. You know, that was the end of their life as they knew it. And so when those concepts came out of doing the first season interviews, and you could go in and you talk to these academics who had even deeper knowledge, and one person would say something, you'd be like, oh, that's a thread that we need to go and then talk to them for the next. And we have a huge team of researchers, by the way. When I say huge, we have 2 amazing researchers, but that's quite a big team for like a smaller podcast company. So I just want to stress that human resources comes from a teamwork. Like, I might be presenting it, but there are people. It would not exist if it was just me, you know, or it wouldn't exist all if it was just me, because Renee wouldn't be there.
Very much the same for mine. Massive team.
And butterflies too.
Yeah.
Did you come to it with a sort of structure in mind, or it sounds like you kind of that you did your gathering first?
Yeah, I think before sort of going out and doing the interviews, we had to sort of me and my producer Sarah Peters and exec Theo Leludis sort of did a rough map of like what 6 episodes could look like, the sort of places we might want to go, people we might want to speak to, and it probably looks somewhat similar to the final product, but I think you can't really do that properly until you know exactly what you've got. So mostly kind of having gone out and got the material, then coming back and seeing how best to structure it. And I think in terms of kind of how you sort of build a script from there, like you said, Moya, that you start by just kind of blank page, start writing, and then kind of clips feed in later. Me and Sarah Peters will kind of go through all the scripts and then do a sort of joint exercise of bringing across all the clips that we think are going to go into episode 1. So you'll end up with a 80-page document of clips, and then I will sort of use that to kind of craft the story around the clips that are in there, kind of moving them around, scrapping them, writing around them. So very much the clips are in there first, and then I write around them rather than sort of. But I know that other people write differently. For the series we have coming out next week, the writer very much kind of, she has all this information in her head and she's sort of getting it out, and then it's like, okay, we'll now feed in the sort of clips around it.
Yeah. Anishka, when you're working with Ivan, was he scripting, or were you sort of supporting him to script? Or because it's somewhat different when it's someone else's voice and someone else maybe who isn't a professional writer as well.
Yeah, and it was more important for us that it was everything he was saying was in his own words and coming across in the way that he would say it, potentially to a friend, or how he would just talk conversationally. So we had a script because we often, our script was having to explain medical conditions and explain treatments and things like that. So we had a lot of factual things, but then we spent a lot of time with Ivan writing it into ways that he would prefer to phrase it. And even just, I think we all talked about this, that you just change things when recording. We all talked about, I don't know if we want to talk about how much about saying the script out loud before you record it. I think
absolutely.
all of us, you do that with Renee. Makes a huge difference, because when you hear it, you suddenly think, oh, there's a much better way to phrase that. And I think for Ivan, just figuring out the ways that he was more comfortable phrasing things. And I think increasingly, I don't know how, it's nice if narrative podcasts can sometimes tap into the ad-lib kind of sector. So if a presenter is not quite comfortable with how something's been scripted, just letting them say it in their own words, just to the microphone, I think that can be a nice way of doing things as well.
We've done that quite a lot, actually. And I know that there is sort of the real fashion for a producer to be on mic quite often, and we've done that quite often. Again, I think it's that thing of making sure that there's a reason why, and it doesn't just become a sort of bit of embroidery. So we had that in The Messenger, our journalist Shiv, whose personal story it was, whose complete like career and life marriage breakdown was the sort of feature of this whole narrative. He and our producer Pete Sale went up to Manchester to revisit some of the places he'd been, and and there's some great bits of them chatting away in the car, which I could see the point of them. When we came to make Hunting Ghislaine with John Sweeney, obviously he's been a journalist he's in his 60s now, for like 40-something years, and he knows exactly what he wants to say. But helping him to break out of the panorama mould or the Newsnight mould, he needed to have conversations with Ruth, my business partner, who was producing with him, just to get him to relax and speak the way he speaks normally, which is very sweary and very entertaining and quite relaxed, and actually really lifted a lot of what he wanted to say, because a lot of it's really heavy subjects, and you need someone to just sometimes just go, what just happened? I can't believe I'm reading this. You know, I can't believe this person spoke to me and told me this. And actually lifting the lid a bit on the humanity behind the people who are telling the story, I think, is quite important. We do often table reads, which we lifted from a US partner we worked with, where we actually try, if we can, to get all the clips cut and read it as if it's a live script. And it's amazing how much that gives everyone the adrenaline boost to really lift and tighten what they're saying, realise when they've used the same metaphor one too many times, or if that metaphor is the one they really want to be using and they've used 3 different ones and they'll scrap some. So I'm a massive believer in reading it out loud. Even if you can't get the clips cut, actually using the transcripts and just getting a few people around to play act it with you is almost more entertaining sometimes.
Yeah, we've been doing that with Call Bethel, which we've got, the one that's just about to come out. And for me, kind of coming from a sort of print background, but then having made these podcasts, I do kind of lift into an audio brain. But when I've been sort of helping edit sort of episode 1, and just you've got to a point where you're like, I can't see any more to do to make this better, and you can get a bit frustrated when you keep looking at it, and then you sort of take it out, sit and listen to, close your eyes, listen to Catherine read the narration and the clips play, and then you can sort of start to sense how it will come together, and it saves you a version, like a cut.
And a lot of Google comments.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes you just don't want to read any more Google comments inside of a doc, ever actually. Yeah. God, I think I've just had a traumatic moment. Apart from that, obviously we kind of touched on a few things about like getting really good interviews, and Moya, you mentioned the role that sound designers play, and I mean all I can do when it comes to talk about sound design is just go thank you, these talented people who want to come and elevate what you've made and make something really beautiful out of it. But are there other elements, parts of a show that you think are crucial or really lift it, or when you're looking for something, for a story or to make a project that you're like, we need this?
That's a good question. Honestly, I think the elements you've mentioned are the basic ones you need. As you said, so long as you've got like, so basically podcasting is not easy. It takes a lot of work. To produce something really slick, then you probably will need a larger team, and it's really good when you start out in narrative podcasts to be aware of your own limitations. And I don't mean that in a constraining way, I mean that you will make the best thing possible if you're aware of that. But I think sometimes you have the basic elements of sort of like a presenter or a host who can carry that story, that texture that I talked about within the script, and a bit of sound design, whether that is a paid professional, whether you're using sound design from free sort of websites, you can create something special. And that's why I'm probably like, I don't know if you need extra elements, because I don't want to make it seem like you need 20,000 things in order to make a brilliant podcast. I do think that obviously, if you're doing a monologue podcast, again, you need to find a way to tell that, and that's still narrative. You need to find a way to tell that that's really entertaining. So whether that's getting in a few friends to do like sort of acting or changing up the voices, then that's something important too. We were talking earlier about American Scandal, which is almost that's one single person telling a story in that podcast, but they use voices of actors, etc. And if you have mates, then you can get them to do that same thing if you're producing your own. But yeah, I think the essential elements are, you need to have dynamism, like I don't know how to pronounce it, dynamic. It needs to be dynamic in some way, whatever you're doing, but I won't prescribe anything more than that, because I think that will be too limiting.
I think that's fair. I think having a driving character is the thing you can't miss. And then everything else, I mean, you told me off stage about the dream tape that you found. We had dream tape when we made The Messenger, although it was all recorded on dictaphone, so we spent quite a happy week on eBay trying to find the right player for it. But I think those moments are like gold dust.
Yeah, we had actually, so in the second series of Bed of Lies, the dream tape that Laura's referring to was, I interviewed Claire, whose husband had been infected with HIV, which she contracted from him, and then he very sadly died. And that was in early 1990s that he died. And in the course of our interview, she mentioned that she'd bought him this dictaphone before he went on this last holiday, which he sort of knew that he was falling ill and he might not live much longer, and he got a camper van and he went off around Iceland. And she mentioned that he'd taken this dictaphone, and I was like, do you still have that? And she was like, I think maybe somewhere in the garage. I was like, well, if you do, that would be great. And after I left, like a few weeks later, she managed to find the dictaphone, and she played the tape and to herself first, and she sent me this voice note, and she's like, that's the first time I've heard his voice in 30 years, and it's different to what I remember, and it's just this real goosebump moment. But we managed to digitize that tape, and then what we have in episode 1 is you hear from Brian himself, and so he is a character in his own right, and he actually has a chance to speak, which I think kind of just really lifts that whole episode out from kind of having other people tell his story. But then later in the series, actually, maybe kind of relevant in thinking about getting creative, there were these other tapes that I really wanted. Like from day one, I was like, these are the tapes we need. And it was a deposition in America of a prisoner who had donated blood, which was infected, which was used in a trial in America to get a guilty verdict against the pharma companies. And I was like, well, we've got to have these tapes. These tapes are going to make the whole end of the series. And we had all these lawyers looking for them. They thought they were in storage. They tracked down the storage unit. They couldn't find them. And it was basically like, we're not going to get the tapes. What are we going to do? But we managed to get a transcript of this interview. And so we then got Tom Mole, the American lawyer, and he roped in his next door neighbour who could do a very good southern Louisiana prisoner accent. And they kind of read out the script. And I think that kind of, if you've got a letter in the series we've got coming out, not to give too much away, but we've got a letter written by one of the villains. One of the villains wrote this letter. He's now dead, but we've got this letter. And rather than sort of getting the writer to just sort of read it out herself, we've roped in some poor unsuspecting man from the newsroom to read out this voice of this absolute villain. And I think that is a real punch at the end of the episode. So getting a bit creative, which is kind of similar to what Moya said about getting in actors and people to think about how to tell parts of it.
I think being playful with it, where it's appropriate, is definitely worth doing. I know we're sort of coming towards the end of our time before questions. I'm imagining, I may be wrong, that a lot of the audience are around the kind of story finding stage, or thinking about what is it that they need to make story. And I wanted to touch on that briefly, but also the ethics around finding stories, because obviously a lot of these are spin out from very big issues, big stories that may have been well reported. And there was, it's happened sort of to lots of people. There was a recent Twitter thread by a journalist who worked for The Atlantic magazine, who said he'd worked for 5 years on a story and then had it ripped off with no credit. And I think this has happened to him on several stories, that he just had his work ripped off. And I think that when you're looking around for a great story and a well-told story, features and written features and other people's work is a really good starting point sometimes. But what's sort of the next step as far as you guys are concerned? Maybe Anishka, do you want to start on that?
So we talked about that case briefly before, and I think we all came to the conclusion, just don't do it, ideally. Let's respect other journalists, support other journalists. The thing that baffles me most is, why would you not want to work with the person who is clearly the expert, someone who's gone and done all this? Why would you not welcome them and collaborate and ask, what should the format of this podcast be? Where is the story going? It just baffles me that someone, and also that this journalist, I think they are reached out, but like the company do tell them that they are going to make a podcast, but that's it. It's not really this kind of recognition for all the hard work and the sources that they've collated. So stories, I think it's, I just wanted to mention quickly that, Cara, what you said about the voice note, was it Claire? What was
Claire.
It? Claire. That that's a really lovely kind of idea of where stories can come from. That I think we always think that, of course, you should do your best that audio quality is always the highest it can be, because that will make a good podcast. But that doesn't mean we need to sacrifice and not, like, it's so lovely that Claire recorded that voice note for you, and like whatever quality that comes in doesn't matter, because the power is so much more important than the quality. And I think just never be afraid to just pick up your phone, and if you want to record something that may end up being the basis for a great podcast or a great story. Because stories, I think, can come from anywhere, and the quality can be figured out afterwards, I think.
Yep. Yeah. Moya, did you?
Yeah, sure. In terms of stories, I would think about the things that are around you that you know. I think there is probably, if you're not in the journalism world as well, there's probably a pressure that you might feel to get these big, massive blockbuster stories, and like, I need this scoop that no one's ever looked at before. You don't need that. The most interesting story is probably already in your backyard. It means just talking to people around you, looking at the local community around you, and you'll find things out of there. Immediately when I was just sitting here, I was thinking about that amazing building in East London, for example. That first was, I think, a church for like the Catholic Huguenots. Then it became a synagogue. Then it became a mosque. That's a story of like generations in one building, and that's literally just like round the corner. These things are all around us. They're in the people around us. You go down and talk to people in your local community, especially the older people, they will have stories. And that's where you find the sort of sparks of inspiration. So yeah, you don't need to have like these huge blockbuster scandals if you don't have the access to the sort of resources to do that. You can find the story around you, and it'll be that much more powerful and that much more authentic for having done that and it being true to you, rather than being like, I have to do another podcast about Marilyn Monroe. So that's my advice.
And I'll just add one very quick thing, because I know that we've got to finish up for questions. Would just add that, gather your own material, do as much independent research as you can, and that this work takes months. Don't be thinking that you can rush it. At least 6 months, but it's a great process. It's so enjoyable. Every stage is fascinating in its own right, and so I think don't kind of like try and skip through steps. Just try and kind of gather as much of your own material as possible.
Yes, take your time, definitely. Thank you all very much. I'm really sorry we've blown through our question time.
Oh, no.
But yes, I've just been told. I was hoping that we might have the chance, but maybe that's something that you guys can tweet us with the International Women's Podcast Festival hashtag, and we'll do our best to get answers back to you guys, because I always think it's nice to be able to share as much as possible when people have specific questions as well. But thank you to Moya Lothian-McLean, to Anishka Sharma and Cara McGoogan, and thank you all for joining us.